Welcome to the Underdog Sniper Podcast. I'm your host, MGCovers. This is episode 65. Happy Monday, July the 7th. Hope everybody had a great 4th of July. A lot of fun for me. Finally went back home, visited family in the ATL. Was there for about a week. And then now doing a vacation. I'm in Puerto Rico, so I'll be here for a little bit before going back to the Dominican. So a lot of traveling, a lot of stress with that, but I'm happy to be here talking with you guys. We got a ton to cover in this episode. Pretty much what we're going to talk about in this podcast is the new bill that was introduced and passed that's going to affect sports bettors, both winning and losing sports bettors. I probably have a very different take than what you've heard on maybe another podcast or seen something on Twitter that's going to give you a lot of insight, because this is not doom and gloom. Sports betting and being profitable in this industry, albeit very difficult, is still a good business and will continue to be a great business for years to come. I'm not really just saying that. I'll prove it to you when we start to talk about that. But that's going to dominate the majority of podcasts. We're also going to talk about what's going on with Major League Baseball. And I think the direction that I'm going to go moving forward, not with sides, but with totals. I think the All-Star break comes up. I think it's this week. I think today's the last set of games. I can't remember. But let's dive into that. Let's take a look at, first I want to mention the side. So we made some changes with the model. And what we've actually wagered in the last 2 weeks has been profitable, 11-11, basically hitting 50%, up 1.1 units. I don't have that on the screen. My apologies for that. And then we also worked on this totals model, which I do believe is going to be the direction we're going to go in the second half. When you're assessing in sports betting, you always want to ask your question, do I feel like we have an edge? And what has the best chance of profit? And I feel like this totals model does. Granted, it's a small sample size. I'll scroll down to the bottom. We haven't officially started wagering this, but we've tracked it here the last few days. And this is a back test that I run with the model from 624 all the way up to 7.6. So it's currently 16-9, 6.1 units. And we're playing only unders. My approach to totals has always been, I think you have to have a niche. Totals is very, very difficult. So you have to have an edge. Generally, you won't have an edge. At least it's been my experience on both sides of the fence. Generally, there'll be an edge on one specific side. For example, I think it was 3 years ago with NHL, we brought out the NHL model for totals. They had made some changes with regards to scoring, and NHL totals were through the roof. Most the books never adjusted. They would generally set totals 6.5 max. This was before you saw a lot of 7-game totals. Under cash from second half of the season to the end of the season, that model cashed at like 60%. It was wild. And those of you that were clients around during that time remember that. So again, it was sort of a niche based on what was happening in the sport. And then, back that up with a good model as well. And I think that's what we're seeing. And to carry over from last week, pitching has caught up with hitting. Your better pitchers have learned to control and beat good hitting. And I know that was a classic, good pitching beats good hitting, but that wasn't true for the last couple of years. You would have a good hitting team going up against a good pitcher. The good hitting team would generally win over the good pitcher, but now it's definitely changed. So what you see here, to give you an idea what we're looking at, this is basically an F5 line that I create here, and we're using that for totals, which is pretty much pitcher dominated. And over here, you see the totals line. And what's interesting about this, look at these low total lines, but still going under 7.5, 6.5, 7.5, 7.5, 6.5. I mean, I don't even think we see a 9, and there's one for 9.5 that lost. 8.5, 9. And then right here, 8.05, that's the totals amount that it's average. Now, I learned this from Bob McHugh, my mentor. He mentioned this. When a sports book adjusts and has an extreme, he was referencing NFL. When a sports book has an extreme low total, there's a reason for that. And people will often say, oh, that's a low total. Maybe it's like 6.5 for Major League Baseball. That means, the books are anticipating the under, but that's not actually true. The books are anticipating an under, but the reason that line is so small, is so low, they want to get some action on the other side, the over. So what Bob McHugh said was, when you see totals at the extreme end, now this isn't always the case, but more times than not, that generally is a good play. Meaning if you see an extreme low number of like a 6.5 in a case of baseball, maybe like a number that's, maybe like 11.5, sometimes it is wise to play in that direction, meaning if it's 11.5 to play the over. And in this case, what we found is it's profitable along with the model to play the under. And so that's something to investigate with NFL. I know unders were extremely profitable, not last year, but 2 years prior to that, just playing unders. I don't think it was profitable this past year, but a lot of those low totals numbers in NFL, more times than not, especially if you can run it with a model, we'll go on the under. We'll go under if it's like, I don't know what a low totals number is for NFL, 35, 36. But looking at this MLB versus what we're doing with sides, I feel like this is more profitable and gives us the best edge. And so instead of wagering on sides and then waiting around for totals, I think we're going to go all in and put 100% of our money into wagering on totals here in the second half. And then I'm going to make some tweaks to this, the sides, because I think we can make it profitable, factoring in more pitching the way I'm handicapping it. But for now, this model looks real good, albeit it is a very low sample size. I'll give you that. It's only 25 games, but generally that's how profitable models start. It needs to be profitable early and then, continue to track this, but it's definitely leaning in the direction that it's going to be profitable long-term. And also we'll mention if you are a client or want to be a client, you get access to this entire model, exactly what stats we're using, how we calculate it. Very inexpensive to join, $50 a month. There's a link to join in the description of this, depending on where you're watching or listening, and you get access to this entire model. We have I think 5 episodes. I've showed you what stats that I use. So very, very, very good educational teaching points if you become a client or are a client. And I'm going to make another update to that as well. So super excited about this and the direction we're going. Okay. Now let's switch gears and talk about what has dominated Twitter and social media regarding and I have a completely different take on this, and this may get pretty deep. So I'm just warning you in advance. So in essence, what this bill is going to do, they're going to cap, and I'm reading this on Twitter, and I'll go ahead and read. This is from Zach Zimbel. He's a CPA. And here's what he writes. A bill limits gambling losses to 90% of those actually incurred. For pro gamblers, the 90% limitation also applies to business expenses. This may impact many, but it's much more punitive to those with large gross winnings and losses. And he gives an example below, and I'll continue to read that. If you have 100,000 in winnings, 100,000 in losses, you now owe tax on additional 10,000 of income, assuming a 24% tax rate. That is 2,400. Or if you have 1 million in winnings, 1 million in losses, you now owe tax on additional 100,000 income, basically 24,000 of additional tax. If you are a U.S. citizen or resident, this limitation applies to all gambling losses. This includes wagering on unregulated books, foreign poker winnings, or anything else that meets the IRS of gambling activity. It is not limited to regulating or W-2 winnings. Okay, so that's basic the law. So in essence, you can only write off via the law 90% of your losses. Now, here's what I want to talk about, why the government did this. And let me preface this by saying, those of you who know I do not live in America anymore. If America was a stock, I would sell all of it. America, eventually, the economy in America at some point will collapse. What that will look like, I'm not sure. But America is every dominant country. The Dutch, this happened in the Dutch Empire, this happened to the English Empire, and this will happen to America at some point as well. So what you see in America right now, especially with regards to legislation, America is struggling financially. We all know this. So the macro of this, the bigger picture, this is basically a money grab. So you have politicians saying, created this, hey, let's throw this on the wall and see if it sticks, right? Because obviously this will affect some people, but those that are very smart, very cerebral like myself, very creative will not be affected at all, okay? So that's basically what this is. And again, I'm going to get deep into this because I'm somebody that has lived through 2 IRS audits. And the first one audit, I was released of all liability. I basically won that. I went to court. And then the second one, I literally just had for last year. So that in 2007, I didn't have the business and wasn't in sports handicapping, but now this past one was, and I actually reduced my liability. I would say it was a win. It was about a 5-figure tax liability I had to pay, and I got it reduced down to a significant amount. All right. So that's the bigger picture. So the whole key to all this, and the direction that if you want to succeed in this business, you want to break ties from the government in any way, shape, form that you can. And I'll tell you, number one, again, let me preface this by saying I'm not a CPA, so you want to get advice, but I can tell you I've lived through this. The government, I don't think letting the government know you're a professional sports handicapper or your CPA is the correct way to do this. There's a place on the tax form where you can say what you do. There's a lot of other creative titles that you can use as well. And most people that are successful in life, that run successful businesses, don't pay as much, have a big tax liability. They're smart enough to figure out a way to limit that. So let me just give you an example. So let's say that scenario where you would owe $10,000. So you won 100 and lost 100. Technically on paper, you would owe 10,000. If you had another business in addition to this business that lost 10,000, right? Your liability is zero. So even though this looks worse than it is on paper, if you're creative, if you're a smart human being, you can figure out ways to get around this. And I posted this on Instagram, and this was one of the motivations for leaving and moving outside of America. This is called the foreign earned income. So in essence, if you're a U.S. citizen, but you live at least 334 days during any period of 12 consecutive months outside the U.S., in essence, you don't have to pay taxes on, they adjust it for inflation, but I think it's up to in 2020, it was 107,000. So if you make 70, if you make 80 on paper, what you're showing to IRS, you don't pay any taxes. So my point is, there's a lot of ways to be creative with this that you can get around to where it's just not going to have an impact. And there's probably going to be what I've read on Twitter, meaning this is the CPA's interpretation of it. There's a lot of different people saying that the wording in this, I have not actually read it, but it's a little bit vague to some degree. Now I want to talk about how the IRS works. And again, I know we're going way off topic to some degree, but I think this is important because the sports betting industry will thrive. It will still be a good industry to be in. All right, let me talk about this. First off, if you use a mover, and I've talked about that in the past, somebody that gets money down for you, and I'm not talking about the legalities involved, but if you don't have a 1099, if you get no 1099s, the government doesn't know what you won or what you lost. So I don't know if that's a tip but that's definitely something to think about. And that can also be related to using a PPH, using an offshore book. Granted, it's a little bit more difficult. I've been limited and cut off probably more from the offshore book because when I first started out, I was heavily invested and PPH means paperhead, or what I would call mom and pop books, local bookie, etc. And can sometimes, and I would say sometimes those might be better than even an offshore book, because if the book or service you're using is smart and you're a winning handicapper, they can use your wagers to their advantage, just like a normal sports book would, to move the line, et cetera, et cetera. But again, not getting a 1099, a W-2 or a 1099 is one thing to consider, because then the government knows. Now, with regards to audits and how they work, let me make sure I say this correctly. Let's say you owe, forget sports betting, but to the IRS on your tax return, let's say you owe $20,000. That's what it says on the tax return. But you were creative and you actually, say you fudged on a few things, quotation marks, and you actually owed $25,000. But you showed on your tax return that you owed $20,000 and you sent $20,000. In my opinion, nothing will happen. It will be very difficult the likelihood of you being audited for that extra $5, minimal. However, let's say you had some side job, or maybe another sports book winning, and let's say there was $20,000 that you got a 1099 for, or a W-2, et cetera. Say that was an extra 20,000, but it's not calculated into your tax return. That's what throws up a red flag. So if you've got all these 1099s over here and you've got them all accounted for in on your tax return, and you owe 20,000 and you send in 20,000, 99.9% chance nothing happens. So when you're doing taxes, and I've always been an advocate of being extremely creative and using every possible advantage that I can when filing taxes. So what would happen? Well, the majority of the time when you get an audit, it's when that doesn't line up. Now, what happens in an audit, what I'm saying, that the point I'm trying to make in all this will be very difficult to enforce, extremely difficult to enforce. Because again, going back to the premise of why this was created, the whole reason this was created is to throw something on the wall from a politician's perspective. And even if it generates, an extra, I think I read somewhere it was going to generate an extra $1 billion in 10 years, so be it. Right. And I think the government knows there's creative people out there in the world like myself that will always figure out an alternative to avoid this, or where it will not be as an extreme detriment to your sports betting career. Back to how the IRS audits. So if they do audit you, they send you a letter. You have, I think it's like 30 days to respond. I don't disagree with it, and show them proof. And then if they don't approve that, then it basically goes to trial. Mine took about a year for it actually to go to an attorney. And this past one that I got, we settled it, y'all, December the 24th of this past December. And what you have to realize, once an attorney gets a hold of your case, he has got a multitude of cases that he's working on. And really his goal, even though he works for the IRS, it's a job for him. So let's say hypothetically he has 100 cases and there's 20 of them that he can solve or resolve rather quickly. He wants to focus on those, because if it's not resolved, he has to prepare to go to court. So he would much rather resolve that. And when I say resolve, meaning settle that for a significantly lower amount. So the one I had a huge tax liability, and I basically said, hey, let's try to get this settled. And I threw out a number. He came back at a number, and I settled on his number, and that was the end of it. But what I technically owed to the IRS, which was significant, I'll go ahead and tell you, it was $30,000. I didn't pay anywhere near that, not even close to that. Significantly lower. So my point is in all of this is that it's just a money grab for the government. The likelihood of the government being able to strictly monitor, the IRS being able to strictly monitor this, is extremely low. Your chances of being audited by the IRS extremely low. And then in the unlikely event you are audited, whatever amount that they're suggesting you pay, if you're smart and do some research, you can settle it for basically pennies on the dollar. So that's my take on it. So there's probably going to be a response to this politically as well, to where I don't think it's going to be quite as bad as people think it is. So again, the key takeaway for you to remember, it was just a money grab. So that's all it was. Just, hey, what's something we can do? The world knows sports betting is very popular, just like golf is very popular right now. How can we profit from that? A lot of people are coming up with these businesses to profit from golf. Government knows a lot of people wager on sports. Hey, what's something we could come up with to, profit, to create some tax revenue from sports betting? Hey, this sounds reasonable. We'll throw this on the wall, see if it sticks. The creative people like myself will figure out a way around it. And there'll be some people that pay it. Government makes money on that. It's a win-win for the government. So, but the big takeaway is not to be alarmed. If you're a smart person, and maybe this is something I'm going to do in my stat model program that I'm getting ready to launch here shortly, I want to basically train people to be professional sports bettors. And maybe this is some of that. We can talk in more detail on that as well. All right, so that's going to wrap up this week's podcast. Hopefully we'll have a winning week here with baseball. Appreciate you guys tuning in. Talk to y'all later. Peace.